I know what you guys are thinking right now. You're saying, Josh, how the heck are we still on this subject? And guys, I gotta say, just be patient with me and hang out for this a little bit more. Values can be one of the most useful skills ever, so I might be milking it a little bit with this series, but I think it's just for everyone's benefit if we just kind of go through how we can apply it to everything, right? And today we're going to talk about how we apply it to the human form. We're going to look at portraits like you see here, and ideally, if we have time, I might have to throw this in another video. We're going to looking at two different types of torsos. Anyways, looking at this picture, we've seen this before. What am I showing here? What are we trying to get? Well, this artist looks at the study of heads, like we see here, as if they are like a sphere. There's a lot of similarities between a head and a sphere. Obviously, heads are kind of more rounded. They're not really boxy or square shapes, but you can also see heads as a square shape as well. So this instructor right here is doing just that. They're looking at the head as if it's a square shape, and you can definitely think of it like that too, because you have planes that separate from each other, where this is going to capture light. Maybe the top of the head or the hair in some cases, right, is going to capture a little bit less light, so it's going to look like a mid-tone, and then you have, full-on shadow sides, and you can see that represented everywhere on each different kind of plane. It doesn't matter necessarily where the light source is coming from. It's just, you just want to be able to figure out that when you know where your light source is and where it's pointing, you can figure out what is going to be light, what is going to be mid-tone or almost into shadow, and then what's going to be in that shadow zone. So whatever method helps you to think of the head as a square, a circle, whatever it is, that's what we're going to go for. And we're going to stick with what both of these examples recommend, which is sticking to a simplified 3 to 4 values. And I'm going to say we're sticking to 3 for this video. We're sticking to a light shape, we're sticking to a mid-tone, and we're sticking to a shadow. Now, one thing that we're not going to do, much like this picture does, and I promise we can get into this in another video. I know I keep saying this, but we are not going to go full black like this guy did for the shadow. Yes, it looks cool. It creates a nice comic book looking effect, but for our purposes, we're just not going to reach that full, saturated is not a good term, but just that full black color that we see here. So those are artist illustrations, but what does this look like if we look at an actual picture? Well, here is a model of a head that is broken down into what you guys can see as different planes. Now, obviously, there's a lot more than 3 values going on in this particular model. And again, we're going to see those in the examples and references that we draw from as well, but we need to be able to simplify things in our own head. So if we were to look at this, and I was to be breaking this down, well, I'm going to see all this as kind of like a light family, coming in through here. Some more light is captured here. You guys get it, right? So like I'm looking for my light family, and then all this information here in this changed blue tone color. This is going to be more of like my mid-tone, kind of half almost to shadow shape going on. And then everything back here is going to be, full on into the shadow shape, whatever's happening to the back of the head, but everything that just kind of looks darker than what we've identified as light and mid-tone becomes shadow. So although people don't look like this and they don't have perfectly like squared off plane shapes, this is kind of what I want you guys to be keeping in your head when you do look at portraits and kind of figuring out, all right, so where does the head turn a little bit and a little less light is hitting that form, right? So like that's going to give you the information of, if we already know our light source, our sun or our lamp or whatever it is coming from over here, then we know that wrapping around this side is going to be the dark side of the moon, right? So always kind of keep that image in your head. Now, I said we were going to apply this to human form and torsos too, right? So again, I really wanted to show this example because kind of like right in here, they're going for that 4 value because they went nice and dark with the hair. But if we ignore that hair, we have a nice solid 3 values going on in here. And this is the example of what I'm talking about. So we have our shadow shapes and we have our mid-tones kind of like in here, kind of bleeds in with this one a little bit. And then we have our shadow color or value, right? So we want to be keeping that idea because you can see we have a more hyper-realistic rendering of the same drawing over here. This might actually be, this drawing might have been taken to this level, but we can see that looking at this example right here, we get all the information that we see here within this. It's just a much more crude drawing. So today I do want to focus primarily on kind of sticking to this zone. Going to hyper rendered and realistic like this, that's a whole nother video in itself, and that might even be a different ball game in itself right there. Just because that's a little different of a technique. But what we're trying to understand is where these values hit, why these shadows are created, and what they are on the human body versus why they would be different on a shape. And one last little tip, I do want you guys to be thinking of tonal values. And so essentially what I'm talking about is the idea of having contrast in your value studies. When you're working with black and white, it can be hard to make things kind of pop and a little different from each other, right? So if we take a look down here at the example below, what we see is this house. This is the focal point. Why is it the focal point though, right? Well, if we analyze it a little further, we can see that the roof here is the darkest object in this entire image. So therefore our eyes are drawn to there. These trees are about the same value. These bushes down here, a little bit darker than the trees from my eyesight, but about the same value as the trees. You can kind of see the tree trunk and the ground not too far off from a shade, and then a nice light background, which gives us a nice value relationship of almost going lightest to the darkest, which is right here against the roof. And of course, this contrast of the super complete white, or at least almost white, part of this house or shed or barn or whatever it is, really makes that house stand out. And this isn't going to be a lesson on tone or anything, but looking back at this full picture, we just want to see that if we look at these pictures right here under the readability section, where, if you keep too low of a contrast, you kind of just get a washed out picture. It's the same picture, right? There's the same things going on, but you're not leading the viewer's eye. And as illustrators, we always want to be leading someone's eye. I want to tell you where to look in my picture because I created it, and I want to tell you the story I'm trying to tell, right? So similar, if we go too high of contrast on everything, look, the tree branches and the bushes are all that super, super dark gray or black. And even though the roof is still black, the contrast is not enough to push my eye to that roof. All of a sudden I have whatever it is, 5 different reads. My eye goes here and then here and then here and then here and then here, and I don't sit anywhere. My eye doesn't rest. Whereas again, if we look at that bottom picture, this picture kind of takes us right through, and then we rest right here as we look through that contrast and we see exactly what the artist is trying to tell us. Lastly, before we jump into this, guys, I just kind of want to give a quick example using my own artwork of why is this important. I'm sure I've mentioned this already, but just as a couple examples, right? So when we're creating artwork, why do we need to know value? Why do we need to know how shadows and all that stuff work? Well, you're not always going to have a perfect reference for what you're creating, so that's one of the reasons, but also because you want to be able to have a range in your art. You want to be able to go from doing something like this to doing something like this, and understanding that both of these are kind of conveying the same information. There's a light source, there's a shadow shape, and whatever's going on in between. All I did personally was over here in this example, I chose essentially 2 values, right? I wanted a dark, contrasting comic book black, which again, I know I keep saying don't use it, but here you can see that I'm using it on purpose, right? I wanted that flattening effect. I wanted it to be very illustrative, very comic book-like. And then on the contrasting side, you have something with a lot more detail and shadow going on, and value scale and value relationships, right? So everything is kind of being pushed in this picture, which gives me a more hyper-realistic form. And it all comes back to the knowledge of having basic understanding of value studies and value relationships as to why both of these things can work. Again, completely different styles, completely different images. But when we look at it as just a value understanding, both of these are completely acceptable and have similar value information. So the first image we're going to look at today is this bust of a head. Now, one of the best ways to learn value play on to human form is to get the most still, perfectly still human that you can get, and that is going to be a fake human statue that looks like the realistic thing. This guy can't move. He's going to stay perfectly still for us. He's going to be the perfect model, and we're going to use him to all of that expertise. So what we want to do is we want to stick with our 3 values. So what I'm going to do to get our 3 values is, first off, I have my tone in the background, okay? This is just going to be our general tone. We can always shade into this. We can add a gradient. You can do whatever you want, whatever material you are using and whatever that allows you to do, you can do whatever. But I always say start off with a nice, safe, somewhere in the mid-range gray. A little bit lighter if you're working with something like pencil or something where you need to lift out to create highlights. Okay, so make sure it's erasable. Now, to find my values, I'm just going to go in and color pick here. I'm going to find my lightest spot, which I'm looking at that forehead. So we have our light value here, okay? So if you guys can see, I'm going to turn off the gray layer. That's not white. It looks white, or it almost looks white. I understand, but remember, when we're looking at our value relationships, that's not technically white. We don't want to push it full white, okay? Here, in this section of the head, we have about our mid-tone. It's going to be the shadow shape because this kind of pretty much has a very stark light to shadow contrast. So in this one, we're not playing too hard with mid-tone. We'll call this the mid-tone for this example, and it's going to be something kind of dark like that. Now, if I go in and we're going to color select this section right here, where you can see that nice deep darker shadow, this is essentially going to help us with our detail work, but this is going to be what we're calling our shadow color, or sorry, our shadow value for this picture. So you guys should be able to see we got 1, 2, 3. They are different than each other, light, middle, dark. You could even probably take this one right here and push it a little bit lighter just for the sake of more of a contrast between these two. And then from there, we are going to draw out our picture nice and light and then apply these values to it. And remember, guys, we're going to stick super rough. This isn't about tight details. This is just about the feeling of a 3D picture in space, very loose. So first things first, in order to put value on something, we have to draw something. So here we're going to be drawing a portrait. Man, you know, if you don't know how to draw portraits, I heard there's this really cool guy with this awesome art YouTube channel, and he has a lot of tutorials on there for figure drawing. And I think he just might have a tutorial for how to draw head proportions. You know, I think I'll link it right above, somewhere around now, and you guys can check that out if you need to. Otherwise, you know, we're here drawing it, so I'll go through it with you guys again. But I do recommend, if you guys haven't checked those out, please do. What we're doing here, and you can see from my guides that are blue and green on the side, I just broke them down to the general head proportion. So that top blue line right there, which is kind of like on that first chunk of hair, and then the one that's on his chin, that's going to be our head size. I know you're going to say, it looks like the head goes a little higher than that. Well, that's just hair volume that the artist added to the sculpture. From there, and I just took the guides off because I needed to see, but you know, you have the halfway point, which is the eyes. Halfway from the eyes to the chin, you get about the nose. You guys can see these guides kind of on my drawing a little bit here. And then halfway from the bottom of the nose to the chin, you get the bottom of the lip. Rough estimates, okay? These definitely change person per person. You know, not everyone has the same bone structure, but anyways, going into this, feel free to kind of change this up a little bit as you guys want to. You know, you can add your own characteristics to this guy, whatever you want to do. What we're trying to do is just get a decent solid drawing. It doesn't need to be perfect, but just something that represents a head in a profile view. And then we're going to take what we can see from the light information on our reference to the left, and we're just going to apply it to our reference here on the right. So throwing my guides back up, we're looking in for the eyes. Okay, so I'm throwing my eyes in. I made mine a little bit bigger, but it's okay. They're going to get knocked down a little bit when we start adding in some value. And I'm just making a couple quick touches here and there to fix up my proportions. So personally, I'm going to draw the rest of the bust in there. You guys can just stick with the head if you want, up to you. So I shrunk mine down a little bit here just so I could fit everything in. And now we are going to be throwing on some value. What I'm doing with this example is I'm going to stick to my lightest value first. And you're going to see that realistically, after I throw in this light value, we don't really even need to push it any further. But you'll see when we get there. Spoiler alert right there. But anyways, I'm just looking for the simple shape. Okay, you just want to be looking at this almost like puzzle pieces and just plug it in. Look over at your reference, plug in a simple shape. Don't get too complicated. Don't try to find the little spots here and there. It's going to get too spotty if you have a highlight here and then a highlight over there and there and there. They should be kind of connected in the same grouping or area. And that's going to keep them from looking spotted. Notice things how the highlight on the forehead stops a little bit shorter than the one that it catches on the cheekbone right underneath the eye, right? That one's a little bit farther out because, again, we're thinking about our face dynamics, our shapes, and however you guys are thinking about it. Are you thinking about it like a square? Are you thinking about it like a circle? Either one applies. So I'm going to throw on some of these light side shapes onto the hair. Again, if you guys are not familiar with drawing hair or something like that, remember, think of it as big, chunky shapes. And fill it in. So you guys can already see, before I even finished with the light side here, this is already giving us enough information that I could just call it quits after I kind of draw in that light side right here on the bottom of my bust. But what we can do is we can always go in and push a little further. Remember, we are trying to stick to a very, very limited value scale for this. If you guys want to go in, I can't stop you, right? You guys are going to do whatever you want. But I'm personally trying to stick to a very limited value scale just because I want to get the feeling and the essence of it to portray my lesson to you guys. I don't want to sit here for hours rendering a perfectly detailed drawing. Because while that might look cool and that might be like flexing some skills on you guys, I don't feel like me flexing my skills is anything to help you guys to learn this stuff. So here we're going in with some dark values. Now, what I want to make a point of letting you guys know is that I'm going to ignore my third value scale for this drawing. Reason being is you can see here as I start to lay in some shadows, I don't really need to go to that third level necessarily. So what I ended up doing was taking 2 and then making that my number 3. And what I made as 2 is the background color that already exists, the tone that we laid down. This is why laying down tone is important. Look, I didn't even need to add another value on there. It was already there. So what I'm just looking for is pretty much the darkest shadow shapes in there. Everything else I'm happy with just kind of leaving as that mid-tone. The information's already filled in for me. And I don't really need to do much other than just kind of fill in these little areas that kind of help volumize my drawing even a little bit further. And again, try not to get too spotty with this. You don't want a spot of dark over there, a spot of dark over there. You can see me, I'm kind of like, I got a couple spots in there and then I started to fill them in between because I wanted them to be grouped together and joined together. It's going to be better information, especially you want to think about what if someone shrunk this picture down or saw it really small. All right, so a head is one thing, but we can also practice this on torsos, and I got a male and female one coming up after this, but here we're going to stick to the male for right now. Now, this isn't necessarily a life drawing video, right? But of course, we're learning how to apply this to form, in this particular video, human form, so you do need some life drawing skills. Again, I do have videos on that if you want to check that out before you do this. Otherwise, I do have my grid system here. And this grid is representing head sizes. I super struggle with drawing torsos or figures when I don't have a head shape in there for some reason. I don't know why. I think it's just because that's how I defaulted to drawing figures. But for some reason, I just cannot draw very well if I don't start with a head. I don't know why. If I draw a head, I can draw the most complex figure that I can think of. If I don't have a head, I'm just drawing a blank torso. Well, I'm kind of stuck. For whatever reason that may be. So you guys can see here the cyan color kind of lines from the top of that neck to the left nipple there. That's going to be the head size, right? So remember the male figure proportions. It goes chin to nipple. That's a head size. You got nipple to about the navel or belly button. That's going to be another head size. And then from the belly button to about the bottom of the crotch or the pelvic bone area, the pubic bone, right? So we got about 3 head sizes in here because that's all of the figure that we see. And then the green lines actually are the heads that are tilted, rotated to the side. So you can see that this figure and the ideal proportions for male figures are from shoulder to shoulder is going to be 2 head lengths wide. Generally, when you're looking at a female figure, we're thinking about a head and a half. So these are the proportions I'm thinking of. We have a dynamic pose here too. So this is definitely going to be one of those twisting the torso kind of poses. So you want to be thinking you have a crunched inside, which is the side on the left that we're seeing. And then you have a stretch side, which is the side on the right. So, it's kind of like getting myself a little bogged down with the details here. Try not to get so bogged down by it like I was. Again, I don't know if I was still warming up at this point or something, but I was feeling really tight in this drawing. But you know what? Not all of our drawings can be perfect. One thing I do want to mention, I'm about to get into value here too, though, is the fact that if you have a tilted shoulder, so left side is tilted lower, right side is tilted higher, that's going to tilt the pelvis in the opposite direction, okay? This is a very important drawing skill to work on and just something to know. So you guys can see from our view, left side is lower, right side is higher, and then when it gets down to the pelvis, left side is higher, right side is lower. They counter each other to balance you out better. All right, so I like the way that the values worked out when we did light first on our portrait. So let's do it here again for the torso, and then we can try a different method when we get to the other figure that we're going to practice on today. Now, one thing I will say is if you're going to go this method, obviously the point is just kind of like super high contrast and really limited value scale. But I would even say at the end of the day that this value that I'm going with is too bright, and I probably could have toned it down a little bit. Up to you guys. Really, again, it's like I said in the beginning, we're really just trying to go for a rough picture, and we're just trying to get the idea of the value scale and the value relationships within our picture. So here I'm going to pick out all of the light sections. Realistically, you guys can see that really just the chest to the neck are going to be the lightest areas. Everything else probably would be like a mid-tone, and then I could have came in with a shadow. But what I wanted to do was kind of kick up the contrast and kind of just point out all the areas that are capturing more light than others, I suppose. So, I'm really just trying to boost this one up, especially for you guys to kind of see where you can take your values, right? So for this one, number 2 is my background tone. Okay, so again, we're taking that from the portrait. That worked really well. I did do a darker background tone for this one. If you guys can't tell, than the portrait, that one I had a lighter gray. Here I'm doing a darker gray. And the gray that I'm coloring with right now, if you look at my number 3, it might look close to black, but again, I can promise you it's not black. I'm just gonna keep repeating that until it makes sense, at least for these videos' sake. So here I'm just trying to figure out the shapes and the dynamics, and these sculptures that I found, they're really pushing it. They're definitely stylized still. This isn't like exact human anatomy necessarily. They're pushing out shapes and stuff like that, so that way we have deeper contrasting shadows and sharper shadow shapes, I suppose. We can see the muscle structures a little better, right? So I'm kind of using that to my advantage. And what I'm also doing, and I recommend you guys doing this too, if you're trying to stick with the nice chunky rough styling like I'm doing, is to grab a nice big tool. In Photoshop, I'm using a really flat, if you guys can see it, I know it's hard to see when I'm drawing, but it's basically just like a line. So it creates a nice wide brush stroke, and you guys can kind of see that, like it's almost like a marker tip, like the wide side of a flat marker, right? So I'm using that to stop myself from going too far into detail. I'm a very detail-oriented person. Whether that's a good or bad thing, to me it's a bad thing, but I'm trying my best to kind of tone down on that a little bit. So that's what I'm working on here. I definitely recommend that you guys kind of figure out what your faults are too in art, and like force yourself to work on that a little bit. It's always good practice. So anyways, remember, I'm sticking with 2 as my background tone, so I don't need to go in there and add a tone. This is a super, super high contrast picture. I wouldn't add shadow and stuff like that typically all over like I did, but here is the result. All right, female figure here, and you can see that this one done by the same artist, but it's even more stylized in terms of the body shapes and geometrics. So what I wanted to show you guys here is just kind of how I grid out my picture. What I did was I kind of just found, top to bottom, and then I cut that in half, and then I cut those halves in half, and then I did the same grid on my picture over there. I found my center line. These are dynamic poses, so the center line is not going to give you the center of the information. It's not going to be a symmetrical picture. And then you can see I have 2 red lines running vertical up and down. That's going to be one of the half length sizes. So what I mean is like the one that's going from the neck all the way to the one that's right above the belly button. I just rotated that, and then I put that there, and that's centered with the center line. And that just helps me to realize that the shoulder that's on our right side, this model's left side, is touching that line, and then on the other side it's not. So this kind of helps me keep within my proportions. If you've ever seen any of my other videos, I always talk about how I'm really bad at drawing things small, and I always draw things too big. That's why I thank baby Jesus all the time for the creation of digital softwares like Photoshop, where I can constantly resize my pictures. It's definitely made a difference in my work. Anyways, so I got really bogged down by the details of the male figure, so my point was not to do that here. We have another dynamic twisting form here. It's twisting a little bit to us. The body's facing, or the hips are facing a little bit away from us. The torso is facing more toward us here. And then we also have a little bit of a lean going on there too, because one of the arms, if there were to be arms, one of the shoulders is sticking up in the air, tilting the other shoulder. Okay, so you have the right side crunching in, it's squishing in, and when you have that crunching side, whatever you want to call it, the other side has to be stretching in a sense. So emphasizing that, you can see I kind of have those green lines there, the tealish color, emphasizing that on my grid on the reference as well. So just get the drawing in the best you can. Again, we don't really need the cleanest and greatest drawing that you've ever done here. We just need something that you feel comfortable adding some value to. Also, let me know how you guys like to draw torsos or human figures. Does it help you to draw a head in there? Do you get confused when there's no head? Or are you someone that starts with torso? I see a whole bunch of comic book artists that start with torso drawings, and they swear up and down that's how they get dynamic poses. So let me know how you guys like to start off your human drawings. That'd be interesting to see in the comments below. We can see what everyone's up to. Otherwise, what I'm going to do here is I'm just figuring it out, tightening up my shapes, kind of blocking in a little bit of where my shadow shapes are going to be, but I don't want to get overly stiff with it because I do want to come in with my nice big chunky tool and just kind of chunk in those lines. So I'm just figuring out a little bit here and there, giving a little bit of that pedestal, but I'm not really going to be focused on that for this figure necessarily. All right, now comes the fun part where we get to just lay in the shadow. So the last ones we started with the light side. I typically don't say start with the light side. I was just kind of doing that with the first ones because the light side was a little more prominent. But here what I'm going to do is I'm starting with my midtone. So I'm not going to use the background value as my midtone for this picture. I'm going to use, as you can see up there, my value number 2, which is in between that light gray and that dark gray as well. Now, what I'm not going to do is just kind of leave open these little blank spaces for the darker grays. I'm going to go in, I'm going to fully shade in everything that I can see in the shadow family. Now, this is definitely a good practice for you guys if you are working with charcoal or something like that and you're worried that you're going to go over something and not be able to find it again. This is definitely a valid concern. I remember having this problem when I would work with charcoal where it's like I'm trying to lay in a shadow shape, but there is a specific shape that I drew that I want to come back in, and if I go over it, I'm going to be worried that I can't find it again, etc., etc. Force yourself to go over that. Just because you drew it once, you guys can draw it again for sure. And you never know that you might actually, after throwing in this big shadow family, you might have a better understanding and a better way that you want to handle that shape that you were going to originally shade in darker or lighter, whatever the case is. So, like obviously under the breast there, it's going to be a darker shape, but I went in and made it all this mid-tone-ish shadow gray. Anyways, just to kind of push myself to find these shapes again and maybe come up with a more dynamic range of how to solve the problem. So what I want you guys to see here too is that on some places I'm kind of just choosing to put more shadow in than is there. Again, this is a very stylized figure here. This doesn't necessarily make sense on like a anatomically correct perspective. So I'm just kind of pushing in some shadow shapes where I see fit. And again, I want them to be more closely related to each other and grouped together, not dotted and spread all over the place. So it's better for me to just kind of group them together, have them touching, and fill it in. All right, so we're almost through here with filling in our shadow shape, and then we're gonna go in for our dark. So again, I'm just kind of looking for anywhere and everywhere that there's shadow and putting in this first tone laydown. We're gonna go in and finish this up. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab that darker number 3 value, and I'm gonna lay in some of my darker tones for those details. Now, I do want to say, if you guys are someone that is a highlight junkie, I'm definitely a highlight junkie, but I overdo it for sure. So I'm not going to actually go in with that number 1 value. I'm going to leave my background tone as my light value. It's going to look more believable at the end of the day, but I don't want to stop you guys. If you guys do want to go in with that highlight value, go for it. I'm just letting you guys know right now that I personally chose not to go for it in this picture, so you guys won't be seeing that. So I just threw in a little bit of a core shadow right there. I don't know if you guys see that, but if you look over at the reference, right under where I have that line for the grid, there's a really beautiful core shadow on that kind of opening of the shoulder arm connection right there that I had to throw in. For here, I'm just looking for my deep, dark shadows. Remember, think of this as like geometric shapes. Think of it in terms of what are you pushing? What do you want your viewer to look at? And stuff like that, right? You know, you can add in these details. Don't get too spotty with it. It's really easy to get spotty. So you can see, like, I was almost going to leave it like that, but then I came in and just kind of connected those shapes. And this is going to be it for this one. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Sorry this was kind of a quick and dirty thrown together video, but sometimes I just feel like when we focus too much on like hyper detailed realistic renders and stuff like that in terms of practicing, it kind of hinders our performance in terms of letting ourselves just be loose and figuring out the values and stuff. So that's why I like the quick and dirty method. But hopefully you guys try this out. Let me know how it goes if you do. Thanks again so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.